One might imagine that a life at sea in pursuit of treasure would involve a certain amount of glamour, or at least the occasional moment of fresh air. The reality for most pirates, however, was defined less by chests of gold and more by the stubborn persistence of damp socks. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. The so-called golden age of piracy unfolded during the early 18th century across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the far stretches of colonial trade routes. Pirates were, in essence, maritime opportunists, united less by grand ideals than by the mutual desire to avoid starvation and royal justice. Romantic tales have done their best to gild the era, yet the facts remain stubbornly unvarnished. Crews were largely composed of the unemployed, the desperate, or the hopelessly optimistic. Most were lured by the promise of equal shares and freedom, though what awaited them was an unending cycle of hard labor, questionable food, and the perennial risk of being hanged by the nearest available authority. It is difficult to name another profession so thoroughly misunderstood, where the greatest luxury was a slightly less worm-ridden biscuit, and the only reliable currency was rum. Pirate democracy did exist, but it functioned more as a method of distributing blame than as a form of governance. Votes were often held by voice and volume, a system which ensured that the loudest man with the least to lose enjoyed disproportionate influence. The infamous Pirate Code, supposedly a document of fairness, was more a loose collection of suggestions, many of which were regularly ignored after the second barrel of grog. For those requiring a visual, consider the typical evening meal. The menu usually consisted of salted beef, hardtack biscuits, and on special occasions, dried peas. These items did not improve with age, which was unfortunate because most had been aboard since the previous season. The biscuits often contained more weevils than flour, and yet it was considered poor form to complain about the extra protein. Fresh water was a rare treat, and generally tasted of the barrel in which it had been stored. Sometimes wine, often mildew, and on one memorable occasion, lamp oil. If the food failed to break spirits, the sleeping arrangements made a determined effort. Sailors slept in hammocks, strung beneath creaking beams, less for comfort and more to avoid being dashed to the floor when the ship lurched. Rainwater dripped through patched planks, pooling in odd corners and ensuring that no clothing remained truly dry for longer than an hour. As for personal space, the only privacy most pirates enjoyed was the time spent clinging to the ship's rigging, usually during a storm. Yet, despite the inconveniences, the pirate's life offered a rare opportunity for those cut off from polite society. Crew members were, at least in theory, entitled to a share of the prize, after the captain, the quartermaster, the surgeon, and anyone else with an official title had claimed their portion. It was a complex system that somehow managed to disappoint nearly everyone involved. This is the world into which so many dreamed of escaping, only to discover that the pirate life often meant little more than surviving the next week. As we step aboard, remember that for every legend of buried treasure, there are 100 stories of broken masts, empty larders, and men who quickly discovered that the sea is far less forgiving than any royal jailer. With that in mind, we drift onward to the realities of pirate recruitment and the unlikely beginnings of a life at sea. The golden age of piracy unfolded in the early 18th century, an era when the world's oceans had become highways for European commerce, and inevitably for its more enterprising outlaws. The Caribbean Sea, the Atlantic coastlines of the Americas, and even the edges of West Africa served as the principal stage for this unlikely migration of the jobless, the dispossessed, and the recklessly ambitious. Great empires dispatched vast treasure fleets to ferry gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco across waters that were by this time as familiar with cannon smoke as with the stench of rotting bilge. European colonial administrations plotted territory with all the precision of a drunken cartographer, leaving much of the day-to-day enforcement to governors who preferred their paperwork dry and their pirates hanged. The majority of pirates were men who had been sailors, laborers, or soldiers. Their clothing was a motley assembly: coarse linen shirts, patched breeches, and battered leather shoes, stitched together by necessity rather than fashion. Colors faded quickly in the tropical sun until everything settled into a practical shade of brown. Any attempt at personal flourish, such as a colored sash or a scrap of lace, was more likely the spoils of a recent raid than a relic of former glory. Jewelry was rare and teeth even rarer, thanks to diets that proved consistently hostile to both appearance and digestion. The daily rhythms of port towns, such as Port Royal, Nassau, and Tortuga, were determined by the tides and by the arrival of merchantmen loaded with commodities and occasionally prisoners. The smell of tar, brine, sweat, and overripe fruit drifted through ramshackle streets, lined with wooden buildings that had the ambition, if not the structural integrity, of more permanent architecture. Roofs were patched with palm fronds, broken tiles, or, when desperation truly set in, sailcloth. Livestock wandered where they pleased, pausing only to inspect the refuse that accumulated faster than anyone could pretend to remove it. Religion existed in these territories, but was largely observed in the breach. The Anglican Church and its Catholic rivals maintained small outposts, though sermons were poorly attended unless they concluded with a free meal. Bibles were far outnumbered by bottles. On board the ships, prayers were muttered before storms or battles, usually with the hope that divine intervention might fill the sails or empty an enemy's powder magazine. Superstition filled the gaps left by formal worship. Sailors nailed horseshoes to the mast, avoided whistling for fear of summoning wind, and recited charms against the evil eye. If these rituals had little effect, they at least gave the crew something to do while waiting for the wind to change. Trade formed the economic engine of the region, pulling sugar, coffee, tobacco, hides, and rum through networks that were both legal and otherwise. Agricultural estates, run on the backs of enslaved Africans and indentured laborers, stretched inland from the harbors. The cane fields crackled with heat and the relentless rhythm of the cutlass, producing mountains of raw sugar destined for refineries in London, Amsterdam, or Paris. The architecture of these plantations was functional and stern: stone houses with deep verandas, storehouses with barred windows, and kitchens detached to reduce the risk of fire. In town, the architecture revealed a blend of European aspiration and local compromise. Timber, coral rock, and wattle and daub walls offered minimal resistance to storms, termites, or the occasional arsonist. Pirates occupied the margins of this world, moving between sea and shore. Their ships were most often captured merchant vessels, retrofitted with extra guns and little in the way of comfort. The decks creaked underfoot. The sails were patched with whatever cloth could be found, and the air below decks held an aroma that defies polite description. Equal parts sweat, tar, and what might optimistically be called preserved meat. The typical pirate ship was cramped, crowded, and noisy. Hammocks swung from beams, while casks of fresh water, barrels of salted meat, and sacks of ship's biscuit filled every available corner. Tools were simple: ropes, pulleys, axes, and the occasional borrowed carpenter's plane. When repairs were needed, which was often, the crew relied on ingenuity, leftover nails, and an optimism that bordered on the delusional. The soundscape of these floating communities was a jumble of shouted commands, creaking wood, clanging pots, and the ever-present slap of waves against the hull. On land, the markets rang with haggling voices, crowing roosters, and the clatter of wooden carts. The climate itself was rarely accommodating. Torrential rains transformed streets into rivers, while the tropical sun reduced tempers and clothing to tatters in equal measure. Mosquitoes attended every gathering, uninvited and insistent. There were notable figures whose names echoed through the region: Charles Vane, Edward Teach, and Henry Jennings, to name a few. But their notoriety was partly the invention of pamphleteers and colonial officials eager for scapegoats. The average pirate was more concerned with the next meal than with fame. Laws existed, both ashore and afloat, though enforcement was largely a matter of convenience for those in power. Governors issued decrees from behind fortified walls, while privateers, holding legal commissions, walked a line so thin that one wrong turn could see them hanged with yesterday's enemies. This was the unstable, crowded, and undeniably aromatic world in which piracy flourished. It was less an age of glory and more an age of improvisation, where survival depended on quick hands, a willingness to endure discomfort, and the vague hope that fortune, or at least the weather, might improve. From this tangle of commerce, chaos, and colonial ambition, the pirate crews took shape, each man and woman bringing with them more baggage than belongings. It is from these uncertain beginnings that the so-called Brotherhood of the Coast would emerge, prepared to take whatever the sea and its many masters might grudgingly provide. Recruitment to the ranks of piracy was rarely the result of considered planning. Most found themselves swept up by circumstance, pressed into service after the capture of a merchant ship, deserted from a navy or privateer vessel, or stranded in a port where legitimate employment was as scarce as potable water. The dividing line between piracy, privateering, and mere survival was frequently drawn by someone else's pen. Colonial powers, such as England, France, and Spain, issued commissions to privateers, allowing them to prey on rival ships in exchange for a share of the spoils and an inconvenient amount of paperwork. The instant peace was declared, yesterday's celebrated privateers found their commissions revoked and their activities reclassified as piracy. The transition from respected agent of the crown to wanted criminal could be achieved in an afternoon, often without the courtesy of notice. Within this environment, invitations to join a pirate crew were often delivered with little ceremony. When a ship was taken, the victors might offer the defeated sailors the choice between joining or enjoying whatever hospitality the nearest port prison could provide. Given the conditions in colonial jails, where rats enjoyed the best of the provisions, many judged piracy to be the lesser evil. There was a certain logic to it. The prospect of a share in captured cargo, however theoretical, had more appeal than the certainty of a diet consisting entirely of weevils and water. Recruitment drives were pragmatic affairs, heavy on persuasion, light on formalities, and usually concluded by the time the sun set. Despite the tales of equal brotherhood, the social order aboard a pirate ship carried its own peculiar rituals. Captains were often selected by a show of hands or shouted preference, a process less about democratic ideals than practical confidence in someone's ability to keep the ship afloat and avoid the noose. The crew might depose a captain just as quickly if his luck ran out or his temper became intolerable. This system bred a particular brand of authority, one supported by consensus and sharpened by constant threat of replacement. The quartermaster, meanwhile, acted as a counterweight to the captain, holding sway over daily discipline and disputes. Though rarely over matters of navigation, it was a balancing act at all hours, and few aspired to promotion. Daily life for new recruits was an abrupt education in discomfort. Pirates were expected to work the rigging, haul cargo, repair sails, and, when fortune smiled, participate in the occasional bout of plundering. Leisure hours seldom existed, and even those were likely to be interrupted by storms, arguments, or the pursuit of another merchantman, unlucky enough to appear on the horizon. Food was distributed from common stores, salted meat best described as fibrous, hard biscuits that tested both patience and teeth, and on rare occasions, dried beans or a meager portion of cheese. The water rations could be augmented with beer or rum, which at least disguised the taste of stale barrels. For some, the greatest hardship was not hunger, but boredom, a slow drift of days, broken only by the sudden chaos of battle. Hygiene remained a negotiation rather than a routine. Washing was considered optional, except before prayer or surgery, and laundry was performed by the simple expedient of dangling clothing over the side, and hoping the salt would do the rest. Hair accumulated salt and knots, while beards grew until a blade or a bout of lice forced the issue. Medical care was seldom available, and the term ship's surgeon could mean a man with a little training, a fondness for strong drink, or both. Injuries were frequent and infections common. Amputation was performed with brisk efficiency, and recovery was generally measured in the number of days before work resumed. It was a system that discouraged malingering but did little for morale. Religious observance at sea was perfunctory. Some prayed before boarding an enemy or weathering a gale, but the demands of survival crowded out most formalities. Chaplains were rare. Superstitions, on the other hand, flourished. It was common for pirates to avoid whistling, refuse to cut their nails on certain days, or insist on a particular order for loading guns. If such rituals brought comfort, they did not bring much change in fortune. Social divisions persisted aboard ship. While pirate codes promised fairness in dividing spoils, shares were allotted by rank and function. The captain and quartermaster claimed extra portions, followed by the gunner, carpenter, and surgeon. The majority received equal shares, though disputes over the counting of coins and the quality of loot could extend into hours of animated argument. Justice was swift and rarely subtle. Theft from the common store, mutiny, or cowardice might earn a marooning, flogging, or in extreme cases, a swift descent to the bottom of the sea. Discipline was maintained as much by threat as by example. The pirate ship, in short, was a floating microcosm of the world left behind, full of ambition, complaint, and the search for some small advantage. Each new recruit entered this society with little more than hope and whatever clothes had survived the last rainstorm. In time, they would discover that the pirate's promise of freedom came with a price measured not only in coin, but in comfort, security, and peace of mind. The next port, the next prize, or simply the next dry night, became the milestones by which days were marked. Against this background of constant uncertainty, the pirate community endured, held together by necessity, opportunity, and the faint hope that fortune might, one day, pay out. With each dawn, the routine on a pirate ship asserted itself with little regard for anyone's preferences. Morning brought the sound of boots thudding upon the worn planks, punctuated by the clatter of tin cups and the weary complaints of men who had not enjoyed a full night's rest in recent memory. The Caribbean sun rose quickly, turning the deck into a sheet of glare and coaxing odors from every surface: salt, pitch, sweat, and the ever-present tang of stale provisions. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was distributed by the quartermaster, consisting most often of hard biscuit, paired with water drawn from a barrel, eager to remind everyone just how long it had been at sea. The rare presence of dried fruit or a scrap of cheese was enough to prompt quiet speculation about the proximity of a recent prize. The work of operating a ship was relentless. Rigging required constant adjustment as the trade winds shifted. Sailors climbed aloft with a mix of practiced caution and resignation, fingers blackened with pitch and rope fibers embedded in their palms. Repairs were ceaseless. Splintered timber might be patched with the remnants of old casks. Sails were sewn with whatever thread could be spared, sometimes unpicked from clothing that had reached the point of no return. Each crew member, regardless of rank, was expected to contribute. Those who failed to do so encountered the persuasive powers of the bosun's rope, a tool more feared than cherished. It was in its way an equalizing force, though few found themselves grateful for the lesson. When not working the ship, men busied themselves with tasks designed to coax a little more usefulness from weary equipment. Knives were sharpened, gunpowder was carefully dried out, and flintlocks were checked for corrosion. Those with a little skill might carve wood for a pipe, or attempt to repair boots that had become more whole than hide. Idleness was viewed with suspicion, and the captain had little patience for those who appeared to be conserving energy for more fortuitous times. Music and games were permitted in moderation, provided they did not interfere with the watch. A battered fiddle or a set of dice provided distraction, though the latter often ended in heated argument when the stakes, measured in tobacco or a double ration of rum, proved irresistible. Religious observance maintained its half-hearted presence among the crew. On Sundays, or what passed for them, a makeshift service might be held on deck, led by whichever sailor could read and was possessed of a sufficiently stern voice. Few paid close attention, but the ritual was tolerated, not least because it provided a rare moment of quiet. Some men wore small tokens, crosses, beads, or bits of cloth, hidden beneath their shirts. They prayed in private, if at all, trusting in luck, skill, and the occasional charm to see them through. Trade remained an ever-present concern. The ships that pirates hunted were not always bursting with treasure. Indeed, most prizes consisted of mundane cargoes, such as dried fish, indigo, or bundles of hides. A successful raid brought a brief flurry of activity, as the cargo was inventoried, divided, and stored. The process was rigidly organized, though the definition of value was elastic. Items that could not be sold to traders in port were sometimes bartered amongst the crew. It was not unknown for a man to trade a barrel of onions for a pair of boots, or for a length of fine cloth to be claimed as compensation for a broken promise. The markets in pirate havens, such as Nassau or Tortuga, operated under similar principles. The architecture in these towns was always functional: wooden shacks with tin roofs, stone warehouses with barred doors, taverns patched so many times that the original timbers were little more than rumor. Relations with local authorities were delicately managed. Colonial governors, such as Woodes Rogers in the Bahamas, oscillated between offering pardons and enforcing crackdowns, their enthusiasm for justice often dependent on the latest instructions from London. Pirate leaders and their crews learned to read these shifting winds, sometimes accepting amnesty, sometimes melting away into the mangrove swamps when the noose appeared too close for comfort. Most pirates had little use for the trappings of state, but they recognized the necessity of keeping one step ahead of official notice. The tropical environment left its impression on everything. Sunburn, insect bites, and fever were routine companions. Clothing deteriorated quickly, so that by the end of a voyage, most men appeared as walking collections of patches. Boots wore through at the toes, hats failed to keep out the rain, and belts served double duty as both support and storage. The air rang with the ceaseless buzz of flies, and the rough chorus of voices, raised in argument, song, or simply complaint. In this world of regular discomfort and irregular reward, the crew persisted. The ship was their shelter and their prison, a realm where every man's fortunes were bound to those of his fellows. It was not the life anyone would have chosen had the world provided other options, yet it was one that left its mark in salt and sun and the stubborn memory of freedom, however brief. From the deck, the sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a reminder that, for most, the next shore was merely the place where the work would begin again. As weeks at sea blurred together, the pirate crew's focus shifted to the essentials of survival, navigation, weather, and the unpredictable temperament of the ocean itself. Pirate ships were by no means vessels of cutting-edge design. Most began life as captured merchantmen or coastal traders, their hulls repurposed more by necessity than by any grand ambition. Modifications were made with an eye towards speed and intimidation. Some guns were installed on the deck, while excess weight was jettisoned in port during hasty refittings. The work was conducted with whatever materials could be salvaged, resulting in ships that balanced increased firepower with a notable disregard for comfort or symmetry. The hulls leaked, the decks buckled, and the rigging was a testament to inventive knotwork and the limited patience of those assigned to repairs. Navigation owed more to memory and guesswork than to charts. Official maps, when available, were coveted, but most pirates relied on local knowledge and the occasional stolen journal. The compass was useful until it failed, and the stars guided those with enough experience to interpret them. On cloudy nights, decisions were made with what could generously be described as optimism. A lead line measured the depth, and when that failed, The crew used instinct, usually the oldest sailors, and almost always contested by others. The sea did what it liked, regardless. Calm days brought an oppressive heat that settled like a blanket over the ship. During storms, the wind howled through the rigging and sent plumes of water over the bulwarks, soaking everything and everyone with little regard for rank or circumstance. The material realities of shipboard life became more pronounced in these conditions. Anything that could be ruined by damp, paper, powder, clothing was jealously guarded. Sails were patched with strips from discarded shirts, and where there was no fabric to spare, holes were simply ignored until they reached an inconvenient size. The scent of mildew mingled with the ever-present salt air and the stronger odors of unwashed bodies and infrequently cleaned livestock pens. Occasionally, a chicken or goat, acquired during a rare foray ashore, would become a valued part of the crew until it was called upon for an especially memorable meal. The ocean itself was both adversary and provider. Fishing lines dangled from the stern whenever the ship drifted or spent more than a day without sighting another vessel. Most catches were small and bony, but even that provided relief from the monotony of preserved rations. Rainwater was collected in barrels, using whatever canvas could be spared, while the more desperate simply drank the less briny seawater, an approach that predictably did nothing for morale or longevity. When provisions ran low, the search for a port or a prize became urgent rather than opportunistic. Pirate ships rarely carried the supplies for a long siege. Starvation sharpened tempers and sometimes led to arguments over the smallest allocation of beans or biscuits. Communication with other ships at sea was a study in improvisation. Flags raised to the mast signaled intent, though there was rarely any confusion about the nature of a pirate approach. Some ships hoisted false colors, pretending to be friends, until the last possible moment. This practice, while effective, was notorious enough that merchant captains learned to distrust any unfamiliar flag, an attitude that made piracy both more risky and, in the minds of some, more appealing to those already inclined to risk. The social dynamics aboard were shaped by these stresses. Alliances formed and dissolved as quickly as the weather changed. Arguments erupted over everything from sleeping arrangements to whose turn it was to clean the communal cooking pot. The negotiation of space and privilege was a constant feature, and the strong or persuasive often fared better than those content to keep silent. Each man's fortunes were tied to his ability to work with others, even when that meant enduring the company of those whose habits or opinions grated. Religion and superstition remained, their roles expanding as the dangers grew. Before setting out on a raid, or when the sky turned black with storm clouds, some prayed aloud, while others muttered charms or fingered tokens for luck. There was little expectation of divine intervention, but even the most cynical rarely objected to a bit of hedge protection. Beyond these routines, the architecture of the ship itself shaped the rhythm of existence. The cramped quarters below deck forced the crew into daily proximity, amplifying every irritation. Light filtered through the cracks in the planks, illuminating hammocks strung so closely that it was possible to feel the movement of the next man's breath. The sound of water sloshing against the hull was constant, punctuated by the groan of timbers, flexing as the ship rode each wave. Above, the deck offered brief respite and the chance to watch the world stretch unbroken to the horizon, until the next order sent everyone scrambling once again. This was a world where the elements and the limitations of human invention provided all the structure anyone needed. The unpredictable, unrelenting sea had little patience for error and never failed to remind the crew that their ship, for all its patched sails and battered guns, was merely a fragile speck upon an endless expanse. Political ambitions, when discussed at all, were kept for the rare occasions when news from colonial authorities reached the ship, reminding everyone that even on the open sea, someone always claimed the right to be in charge. Contact with the wider world did not cease simply because a pirate ship had left the shelter of harbor. News, or at least detailed rumors, drifted from ship to ship and through the ports of the Caribbean and the Atlantic. The appointment of new colonial governors, naval patrols, and the occasional royal pardon were matters of great interest among crews whose fortunes could shift with a sudden change in policy. The arrival of Woodes Rogers in Nassau in the year 1711, for example, sent ripples through pirate ranks. His efforts to re-establish British rule and offer pardons, while at the same time fortifying the island and introducing a modest amount of bureaucracy, left many experienced hands uncertain whether it was time to return to land or simply to adjust their flag and continue as before. Political developments on distant continents sometimes seemed laughably remote, yet they had a way of intruding upon daily decisions at sea. A shift in alliance, a new war, or the end of an old one, could turn a privateer into a pirate with little warning. Crews kept a wary eye on the nationality of their next target, aware that a friendly flag one month might become a capital offence the next. When word circulated of peace between England and Spain, for example, it was not unusual to find ships hastily painting out old marks of allegiance, or captains rehearsing explanations for why they were armed and in possession of another nation's property. The fine distinctions between piracy and legitimate commerce were in practice established after the fact, and usually by someone on a much firmer dock. Trade, both legal and clandestine, linked the floating world of pirates to settlements ashore. In Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal, local merchants were prepared to barter with anyone carrying valuable goods, regardless of their provenance. Smuggling flourished. Molasses, sugar, and tobacco were exchanged for powder, shot, and a few barrels of drinkable rum. Agricultural estates in the Caribbean sent their harvest to Europe, but a portion of every crop vanished along unofficial channels, spirited away by small boats that slipped through mangrove inlets or landed under cover of darkness. Farmers and plantation overseers maintained a pragmatic approach to theft, sometimes benefiting from pirate largesse when times were lean. Life ashore was little less improvised than life at sea. Pirate havens revealed their own peculiar qualities. The buildings stood on timber stilts to weather tropical downpours and the occasional storm surge. Thatch, rough stone, and scavenged brick were used indiscriminately, giving the settlements an appearance somewhere between hopeful permanence and obvious impermanence. The air in these ports was thick with wood smoke, roasting meat, and the unmistakable tang of spilled ale. Streets muddied quickly after rain, and livestock roamed as freely as did merchants' children. Taverns were the focal point of social life, their benches and tables battered by countless disputes and the passing of hundreds of boots. The mingling of nationalities in these settlements created a cultural landscape that was ever shifting. English, Dutch, French, Spanish, and African languages were spoken within earshot of one another. Music borrowed from everywhere, played on whatever instruments survived shipboard travel or local humidity. The result was a blend of folk tunes and improvised rhythms, the sound drifting from open windows or erupting into the street after dark. Food followed similar lines: salted pork, mingled with cassava bread, beans stewed with peppers, and the occasional wild-caught fish roasted whole over coals. The fare was described as hearty, which usually meant that it could be recognized and that it would fill the stomach, if not the imagination. Religion was not absent, but it was reluctant to make itself too central. Mission churches stood at the edges of town, their services sporadically attended. Most who came left their hats on, an act unnoticed by the distracted clergy. More commonly, individuals maintained their rituals of luck and superstition, touching a charm before a wager, or repeating phrases inherited from grandmothers far away. The line between sincere worship and habit was blurred by distance and the accumulation of daily concerns. Social order in these settlements was enforced by a mix of custom, threat, and collective convenience. Formal law was a matter of negotiation. Colonial officials, when present, were greeted with a display of orderliness, which evaporated as soon as their backs were turned. Disputes over property, debts, or insults were resolved with a mixture of arbitration and displays of bravado. The architecture of justice ranged from the stone gales of Port Royal to the improvised stocks or cooling huts found in less established places. Pirates ashore were not immune to discipline, though the standards of behavior remained as flexible as the town's allegiance to distant kings. The transition from ship to shore was never seamless. Pirates arriving in port found themselves caught between the fatigue of sea life and the unfamiliar freedoms of land. The bustle of the marketplace, the promise of fresh food, and the opportunity for a night under a solid roof were tempered by the knowledge that every purchase and every conversation might be watched. Fortunes could be lost as quickly as gained, and comfort rarely lasted more than a few days. In this shifting world, the pirate's existence was marked by constant negotiation, with the elements, with rulers, and with each other. It was a rhythm that, for all its uncertainty, had become second nature to those who chose or were forced to live outside the easy reach of ordinary law. The prospect of dividing the spoils drew many to piracy, with the hope, however slim, of escaping poverty. Yet the actual process of sharing loot was less a moment of triumph and more an exercise in arithmetic and disappointment. When a pirate crew acquired a prize, a captured merchantman, a warehouse raided along the coast, or even a storehouse of goods bartered under questionable terms, the contents were gathered, counted, and handed over to the quartermaster. The quartermaster worked alongside the captain, but his loyalty was theoretically to the crew as a whole. He was tasked with recording the value of everything retrieved, from coins and jewels to barrels of sugar, bolts of cloth, and crates of indigo or tobacco. The resulting ledger was impressive in its detail, if not always in the quality of spelling. The pirate code, varying slightly from ship to ship, dictated how the spoils were to be divided. The captain and quartermaster received 2 shares each, sometimes more, if the voyage had been especially hazardous, or the reward unexpectedly meager. The ship's carpenter, gunner, and surgeon each took an extra portion, on the logic that their skills kept the rest alive long enough to enjoy the benefits. The remaining crewmen, from seasoned sailors to the most recent reluctant recruit, each received 1 share. Injuries suffered in action could entitle a man to further compensation. A lost arm or leg, for instance, might be worth 600 or 700 pieces of 8, awarded all at once, and usually spent just as quickly. The division itself was a public affair, conducted on deck or in the crowded confines of a port tavern. Arguments were frequent. Weighing out coin was straightforward enough, but goods such as spices or cloth required more negotiation. Not all commodities could be divided, and so the crew often resorted to auctioning off the more valuable items, then splitting the proceeds. There was a lingering hope, of course, that each haul would contain gold or silver, but most prizes yielded more in the way of everyday necessities than in treasure. Disappointment was a familiar companion. The market price for tobacco or rum fluctuated constantly, and the realities of fencing stolen goods were far less romantic than anticipated. Once each man received his share, the challenge shifted from acquisition to preservation. Gambling was a favorite pastime in pirate assemblies, and fortunes that had taken weeks to secure could vanish before dawn in a flurry of dice games or ill-advised wagers. Taverns and brothels welcomed paying customers with limited discrimination. A night's entertainment, combined with the purchase of new boots, a few tools, or a bottle of imported wine, could swiftly erase the memory of deprivation at sea. Some pirates invested in more practical luxuries: a new hammock, a sturdy knife, or food that had not spent a season at the bottom of a barrel. Most, however, found that coin burned quickly through their pockets, leaving them in little better condition than before the prize was taken. Law and custom attempted to regulate these exchanges. The threat of theft from the common store or cheating during the division of spoils was addressed with severe penalties. Pirate codes prescribed flogging, marooning, or, in rare cases, execution for those caught defrauding their fellows. These rules were enforced with a certain grim enthusiasm, The prospect of sudden and public punishment did much to maintain order, though it could not eradicate every temptation. Justice, such as it was, depended on the willingness of the crew to act collectively, and on the ability of leaders to settle disputes before they spilled over into violence. Religion and superstition hovered around the proceedings. A portion of the loot might be set aside as an offering to Providence, or as compensation for a particularly harrowing escape. Men spoke of luck as though it were a tangible property, and the crew's fortunes were often interpreted as the result of someone's recent conduct, hard work, laziness, or the breaking of some minor taboo. The quartermaster himself was not immune to suspicion. If the spoils seemed meager, mutterings about poor luck or secret theft would circulate until the next prize appeared to restore faith in the system. The architecture of these moments was simple. On the deck, a battered trestle table held the coins, while barrels and crates were stacked for inspection. In a tavern, spoils were counted upon a scarred plank, surrounded by the smell of spilled ale, tallow smoke, and the chatter of bystanders. The division of loot was, at its heart, about more than just wealth. It affirmed the fragile equality that bound the crew, even as it exposed every tension and grievance within their midst. For most, the end of one division marked the beginning of anticipation for the next, and the endless cycle of hope, labor, and fleeting reward continued. In this, the pirate's life resembled many others, written in shared hardship, fleeting advantage, and the knowledge that satisfaction, however brief, was best savored while it lasted. Pirate justice was an affair conducted with impressive decisiveness and a minimum of paperwork. The compact society of a ship demanded swift resolution to disputes, and the prospect of long, drawn-out trials had little appeal to those with neither the patience nor the inclination for legal niceties. The code by which pirates governed themselves, assembled from precedent, necessity, and the odd bit of borrowed naval regulation, was posted somewhere visible, though the ability to read it was an optional qualification. Breaches were judged by the crew as a whole, which ensured that verdicts reflected the mood of the majority as much as the letter of the code. The result was a system that prided itself on fairness, so long as fairness was measured by speed and a general desire to avoid mutiny. Punishments ranged from the tedious to the terminal. Theft from the common stock almost always resulted in flogging, with the guilty party lashed at the mast while their shipmates looked on. Marooning, a sentence much discussed and seldom rescinded, was reserved for those whose offences imperiled the entire ship: mutiny, betrayal, or persistent cowardice. The marooned man would be left on a desolate island or sandbar, with a small cask of water, a pistol, and as much bread or dried meat as could be spared. Survival was improbable, and the message to the rest of the crew was difficult to misinterpret. For lesser misdeeds, insulting a superior, gambling away essential equipment, or failing to perform assigned duties, the penalties were more creative. A stint in bilge duty was one of the preferred methods of instilling regret, involving hours spent in the foulest part of the ship, clearing out stagnant water and whatever else had accumulated. The odor clung for days, and it was widely believed that a man sentenced twice would learn to mind his manners thereafter. Rarely, the guilty were required to stand watch without rum ration, a punishment that combined public shame with the distinct possibility of sobriety. Disciplinary matters were settled in full view of the crew. The captain's word carried weight, but consensus was prized, at least when the matter did not touch on his own interests. The quartermaster often acted as advocate for the accused, a role that mingled justice with the practical desire to keep the crew functioning as a unit. On occasion, debates over guilt and punishment became heated, though most pirates found little advantage in prolonging unpleasant business. Expedience was the true guiding principle. In an environment where every man might soon be needed at a moment's notice, removing a useful hand was a decision made with reluctance, not relish. Religious or moral considerations rarely shaped these proceedings. Pirates, having little faith in earthly justice, placed even less in divine oversight. Still, there were moments when a perfunctory prayer was recited before a punishment, or when a token offering was made to appease whatever luck governed the outcome. The sound of a whip cracking or a pistol being loaded for marooning became as much a part of shipboard routine as the creak of rigging or the slap of waves against the hull. The architecture of shipboard justice was as improvised as every other element of pirate life. A spare length of rope, a battered plank, or the empty hold served as the scene of judgment. There was no dock, no gavel, and certainly no robed official. The smells of salt air, sweat, and the lingering residue of old punishments filled the space. Justice was done quickly, and rarely spoken of afterward, save for the reminders left on a man's back or in the caution shown by the rest of the crew. Ashore, justice followed similar patterns, though with the added distractions of alcohol and the fleeting sense of anonymity offered by a crowded port. Disputes in taverns were resolved by popular consensus, or by whichever party could muster more friends in the moment. Colonial authorities, if present, might intervene, but their interest was sporadic. In Nassau, under Wooders Rogers, for example, efforts to impose British law were met with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some pirates accepted pardons, exchanged their independence for a vague promise of security, and attempted to blend into the less adventurous ranks of colonial society. Others found that old habits died hard, and that the temptations of the sea were not easily set aside. Throughout, the underlying logic remained consistent. Justice was, above all, a communal affair, shaped by the needs of survival rather than abstract principles. The ship and its crew could not afford prolonged disunity, and even the harshest sentence was carried out in the spirit of restoring order. It was a system born more from necessity than from philosophy. Yet, within its constraints, a peculiar form of equality persisted. Every man understood where he stood, and if memory failed, the bruises and scars provided a durable reminder. Stability, such as it was, depended not on the written word, but on the willingness of all to accept the verdict of the group and continue forward, come what may. Despite the presence of punishments and codes, the organization aboard a pirate ship was marked by a peculiar form of democracy, one that extended further than most contemporary governments dared to imagine. Decisions of consequence, including the election of the captain, the distribution of tasks, and the choice of where to steer next, were often put to a vote. Every crew member was theoretically granted a voice, a notion that unsettled many who had grown accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of naval or merchant service. These votes took place on deck, with the result determined by the raised hands, or, more commonly, the loudest voices. Consensus was valued, though not always achieved, and the process had a way of favoring those skilled in persuasion or in simply out-shouting the opposition. Captains were elected primarily for their ability to command in battle and navigate the hazards of both sea and law. Outside of combat, their word was often balanced by the authority of the quartermaster, who represented the crew's collective interests in all other matters. If a captain's leadership faltered, whether from excessive cruelty, incompetence, or the simple misfortune of a run of bad luck, he might find himself voted out of command with minimal ceremony. The replacement process could be rapid. The old captain would resume his place among the regular crew, a situation that must have tested the diplomatic skills of all involved during the next communal meal. The oddity of this floating democracy did not extend to every aspect of pirate life. For daily routine, efficiency prevailed. Watches were organized, supplies inventoried, and maintenance assigned without much debate. Most crew members recognized the value of order, especially in the face of unpredictable weather or enemy pursuit. Grievances, however, were seldom allowed to fester. The mechanism of the vote, crude as it was, offered a release valve. Discontent over food, unequal workloads, or suspicions of favoritism could all be aired, and in theory, resolved with a show of hands. In practice, the result often reflected the will of those with the greatest influence, or the least to lose. Pirate articles, written agreements, adopted at the start of each voyage, outlined the fundamental rights and responsibilities of every crew member. They addressed matters ranging from the distribution of loot and the treatment of prisoners to compensation for injuries and the use of candles at night. The articles were read aloud to all and signed, usually with a mark, by every man aboard. Violations were judged collectively, and the written presence of such rules allowed for an appeal to principle, even if principle sometimes yielded to the needs of the moment. Social life aboard was structured by this framework of practical equality. Meals were taken together, with no separate table for officers. Sleeping arrangements were equally democratic, distinguished only by the luck of hammock placement or proximity to the least leaky portion of the deck. Even so, unofficial hierarchies persisted. Older sailors, skilled gunners, or those with experience in navigation enjoyed a certain deference, while new recruits, or those with a reputation for carelessness, were expected to earn their place. This system of governance extended, with adjustments, to pirate enclaves ashore. When pirates gathered in Nassau or Tortuga to plan raids or divide spoils, the same habits of voting and negotiation prevailed. Disputes over shares were mediated by elected spokesmen, and communal resources, powder, shot, and provisions, were doled out according to collective agreement. It was an approach that owed as much to necessity as to any vision of equality. Far from any legal authority willing to defend their interests, pirates constructed a society in which every voice could, in theory, be heard. The resulting cacophony was a testament to both the limitations and possibilities of shared decision-making. Religion held little sway over these proceedings, though a prayer might be offered before a major vote, more for luck than for guidance. The architecture of debate was basic, raised voices, the slap of bare feet on the deck, and the creak of wood as everyone pressed closer to hear the arguments. The scent of tar, sweat, and the ever-present tang of salt water served as the backdrop. Beyond the immediate questions of leadership or division, longer-term planning, where to steer next, which ships to pursue, or whether to accept a governor's pardon, was left to collective judgment or postponed until circumstances provided a clear answer. No system, of course, functioned perfectly. The promise of equality coexisted with the realities of strong personalities, enduring grievances, and the unending demands of survival. Nevertheless, the pirate democracy persisted, more durable than the hulls of their ships, and more memorable, for some, than the fleeting rewards of their trade. In an age where most subjects had little influence over their rulers, the spectacle of men settling the course of a voyage, by common vote, was one of history's quieter corrections, achieved not by theory, but by the practical need for everyone to pull together or slip beneath the waves. Ship maintenance and the pursuit of seaworthiness occupied a peculiar place in the pirate routine. The same democracy that decided the course of a voyage also determined, with less enthusiasm, when and how to address the realities of leaking hulls, torn sails, and faltering masts. Most pirate ships were acquisitions, captured from merchant fleets or navies, stripped of unnecessary ornament, and transformed into lean instruments of pursuit or escape. Little about their maintenance could be considered elegant. Decisions were driven by urgency, available materials, and the willingness of exhausted crew to undertake one more round of repairs. The tools available for ship maintenance might have been recognized by a carpenter in ancient Rome. Hammers, saws, augers, and axes were all in regular use, supplemented by an assortment of nails, pitch, and spare planks of dubious origin. Ship's carpenters were among the most valued specialists aboard, their opinions sometimes carrying as much weight as those of the quartermaster, especially when the mainmast displayed a sudden inclination to tilt. Sails were patched with linen or canvas scrounged from cargo, and on more than one occasion, the remnants of clothing too ragged for further service. The resulting effect was rarely handsome, but function took precedence over appearance, a point underscored by the fact that few pirates had any pressing need to impress other seafarers with the condition of their rigging. Routine maintenance was conducted in port, whenever possible, Shipyards in places like Nassau, Tortuga, or Port Royal offered the services of local shipwrights, though prices varied widely and payment was accepted in coin, goods, or the promise of future custom. Careening, a process by which the vessel was hauled onto its side so that the hull could be scraped of barnacles and patched, was a laborious activity requiring the cooperation of the entire crew. The exposed underside of a pirate ship revealed a catalogue of ills, worm-eaten planks, rot, and the remnants of repairs performed with more optimism than skill. Repairs were often described as complete when fewer than 3 leaks remained, and the bilge pump could keep pace with the incoming water. The process of careening was not without its hazards. The ship, left vulnerable on the beach or in a sheltered cove, was an easy target for rivals or colonial authorities. The crew worked quickly, scraping away marine growth with iron blades, applying tar or pitch to the worst of the gaps, and replacing nails where rot had rendered the old ones useless. The scent of tar, sweat, and decaying sea life clung to the crew for days afterward, a reminder that cleanliness and seaworthiness were concepts best considered separately. Above decks, ropes and blocks required constant inspection and repair. Salt and sun reduced rigging to brittle threads with alarming speed. Spare lengths of rope, inevitably spliced and knotted, were guarded with the same jealousy reserved for extra powder or dried beef. Paint, when it could be found, was brushed onto hulls less for aesthetics than to fend off further weathering. The occasional attempt to repaint a ship's name or create a false identity for approaching port officials provided moments of creative diversion, though the results rarely fooled anyone who had spent time at sea. Despite the chaos and the makeshift nature of most repairs, some standard of safety was maintained. The risk of sinking was never theoretical, as every man was acutely aware of the memory of ships that had simply disappeared after a storm or encounter with a well-placed cannonball. It was an unspoken rule that the ship must be kept afloat at all costs, even if that meant forgoing the chance to take a prize or requiring the entire crew to spend a day bailing water instead of hunting merchantmen. Survival at sea depended as much on the willingness to endure discomfort as on the ability to confront leaks, torn sails, and the occasional mutinous groan from the hull itself. The ports where pirates gathered for repairs reflected the impermanence of their clientele. Temporary scaffolds, battered slipways, and makeshift forges crowded the shoreline, accompanied by the usual collection of taverns, market stalls, and houses painted in whatever color of whitewash happened to be available. The air in these places vibrated with the sound of hammers, shouted orders, and the clatter of barrels being rolled to and from the waterfront. Trade flourished alongside repair, with laborers, merchants, and sailors negotiating over the price of rope, nails, and the various things that always seemed to be in short supply. Religion and formality remained peripheral, as few saw fit to bless a job that was unlikely to last beyond the next squall. The completion of repairs warranted celebration, but of the quieter sort, an extra ration of rum, or a rare afternoon without the sound of water slapping against the hull. When all was ready, the ship would slide back into the water, its many faults hidden once more below the surface, and the crew would return to their routines, newly reminded that in piracy, as in most things, durability was always a temporary achievement. The pursuit of fortune at sea rarely yielded the riches that colored the popular imagination. Most pirate ventures resulted in a haul best described as practical rather than lavish. Cargoes of sugar, cacao, indigo, and tobacco were ordinary prizes, prized less for the immediate thrill than for their utility on shore. A ship's hold, filled with barrels of salted fish or sacks of rice, prompted neither songs nor legends. Yet the business of dividing the spoils remained central to the rhythm of pirate life, giving substance to the promise that each crew member, regardless of background, stood to gain when luck favored the collective. Trade in captured goods followed well-established channels, supported by a network of merchants and intermediaries in colonial ports. Nassau, with its lively market, became a hub for the quiet conversion of ill-gotten cargoes into coin or further supplies. Local traders, often eager for profit, regardless of the law, provided a willing audience for anything that could be carried ashore. The exchanges were brisk and practical. Rum was traded for powder, cloth for new canvas, and occasionally a barrel of sugar for the promise of repairs by the town's increasingly unimpressed shipwrights. This traffic blurred the boundary between piracy and commerce to the point of insignificance. Colonial authorities responded with alternating periods of enthusiasm and indifference, issuing proclamations about the sanctity of trade while quietly benefiting from the taxes and bribes that flowed through every successful transaction. The proceeds from these exchanges rarely settled for long in the hands of a pirate. Wages, such as they were, dissolved rapidly into the economy of the port. Taverns and gaming houses saw the most immediate benefit, followed by merchants offering clothing of dubious origin and apothecaries promising remedies for the inevitable ailments acquired at sea. Some coins found their way into church collection boxes, though out of habit rather than conviction. A few men, more forward-thinking or naturally cautious, invested in small properties or attempted to start legitimate businesses, usually with results as unpredictable as the weather. For those who imagined hidden riches, reality offered only brief consolation. Gold and silver did occasionally appear, coins taken from a Spanish galleon, or the odd bit of jewelry pried from a merchant's cabin. Yet such finds were rare and provoked more suspicion than rejoicing. Arguments over the division of wealth were as regular as mealtime. The pirate code outlined the process, but interpretation was a sport in itself. Most disputes centered on the value of goods, not their quantity. A length of fine cloth might be worth a month's pay to one man, and dismissed as useless by another, depending on need and recent experience with port authorities. The architecture of the marketplace reflected this churn of commerce and uncertainty. Stalls were erected from driftwood, patched sails, and discarded casks. The air pressed in with a mixture of sweat, tobacco smoke, cooking oil, and the aromas of goods in various stages of spoilage. Voices rose in a dozen languages, bargaining over items whose value shifted according to the season, the weather, and the mood of the magistrate. Trading took place from sunrise to nightfall, punctuated by the arrival of new ships, or, on occasion, by the sudden flight of all present, when rumors of a royal patrol reached the harbor. Agriculture in the Caribbean and Atlantic colonies supported both legal and illicit trade. Large plantations, worked by enslaved Africans and indentured servants, grew the sugarcane, coffee, and tobacco that underpinned both economies. Smallholders and fishermen supplied local needs. Pirates, ever practical, sometimes struck arrangements with these producers, exchanging stolen goods or protection for food and information. Such partnerships were rarely long-lived or formalized, but they contributed to the persistence of piracy in regions where official oversight was more notional than actual. Religion in this context remained a muted affair. Churches in port towns welcomed sailors of all kinds, but did not inquire too closely about the source of any offerings received. Services were held in stone chapels or modest wooden buildings, their architecture shaped by the need to withstand storms and neglect in equal measure. Attendance was inconsistent. Most pirates preferred to invest their hopes elsewhere, relying on charms, rituals, and the conviction that luck, if not divine favor, offered the best prospect for survival. In the end, the economic life of a pirate was one of continual movement and recurrent compromise. The promise of riches sustained the weary on long voyages and justified the discomforts endured. Yet, for all the talk of treasure, most fortunes, when they came, were spent as quickly as they arrived. It was a cycle that filled the ports with noise, the markets with goods, and the ledgers of local officials with a stream of entries that would attract no attention in a quieter, more respectable age. For the pirates themselves, reward was measured not so much by what they could hoard, but by how little time passed between leaving the sea and returning to it. Pockets once again, light and ambitions undiminished.